The real Jesus is not from the Bible, the forbidden history of Jesus. Have you ever wondered why the most revolutionary figure in human history ended up becoming the poster child for obedience? Why the man who challenged every authority of his time is now used to justify submission to authority? What I'm about to reveal will fundamentally change how you see Christianity, the Bible, and everything you were taught about Jesus Christ. Because the Jesus you think you know never existed. Not the blonde-haired, blue-eyed figure gazing peacefully from church windows. Not the gentle shepherd whispering sweet promises of eternal salvation. And certainly not the divine being who supposedly endorsed the very systems of power and control that he spent his life fighting against. The real Jesus was so dangerous, so threatening to established order, that his true story had to be buried, rewritten, and sanitized beyond recognition. What emerged from centuries of political manipulation wasn't history, it was propaganda. And today, I'm going to show you exactly how it happened. But first, let me ask you something that might make you uncomfortable. If Jesus was such a clear, unambiguous figure, why are there over 30,000 different Christian denominations worldwide? Why do they disagree on fundamental aspects of his message? Why does the religion that claims to follow him look nothing like the movement he actually started? The answer isn't theological confusion. It's historical deception. You see, the Jesus of the Bible isn't the Jesus of history. He's a carefully constructed character, assembled from selected fragments and molded to serve the interests of empire. And once you understand how this happened, you can never look at Christianity the same way again. Let's start with something most people never question: the Gospels themselves. You've been told they were written by eyewitnesses: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But here's what they don't tell you in Sunday school. These weren't written by anyone who actually knew Jesus. They weren't even written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These texts emerged decades after Jesus died, written by anonymous authors who were working from oral traditions, earlier documents, and their own theological agendas. The earliest complete gospel, Mark, wasn't written until around 70 CE, a full 40 years after Jesus' death. That's like someone today writing a detailed biography of someone from the 1980s based entirely on stories they'd heard from friends of friends. But it gets worse. The Gospels we read today weren't even the only ones. There were dozens of other accounts circulating in early Christian communities. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas. These weren't obscure fringe texts. They were widely read and respected in early Christian circles. So what happened to them? Why aren't they in your Bible? Because they told a very different story about Jesus, a story that was far too dangerous for the emerging institutional church to allow. Take the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in 1945 in the Egyptian desert. This text, which many scholars believe contains some of the earliest recorded sayings of Jesus, presents him not as a divine sacrifice for sin, but as a wisdom teacher pointing people toward their own inner enlightenment. Jesus says things like, "The kingdom of heaven is inside you and all around you. And when you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father." This wasn't a Jesus who demanded worship. This was a Jesus who taught awakening. But that kind of message was catastrophic for institutional control. If people could find the divine within themselves, what need would they have for priests, bishops, or elaborate church hierarchies? If salvation was about inner transformation rather than external obedience, how could religious authorities maintain their power? So these texts were systematically destroyed, not by accident, not by neglect, by deliberate policy. In 367 CE, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria issued what became known as the Easter Letter, the first official list of which books would be considered canonical scripture. Any text not on his list was to be destroyed. Libraries were raided. Manuscripts were burned. Entire theological traditions were wiped out. The texts that survived did so only because people hid them in clay jars in remote caves, hoping that someday the truth might resurface. And thank God they did, because without these discoveries, we might never have glimpsed the real Jesus at all. But the story gets even more disturbing when you realize who was behind this massive cover-up. Enter Constantine the Great, the Roman emperor who supposedly converted to Christianity in 312 CE. Here's what they don't teach you in church history. Constantine didn't convert because he had a spiritual revelation. He converted because Christianity had become too powerful to suppress, and he needed to control it. Think about the absurdity of this situation. The same empire that tortured and executed Jesus suddenly declared itself Christian. The same power structure that represented everything Jesus stood against now claimed to be his representatives on earth. But they couldn't just adopt Jesus as he was. The real Jesus, the one who called the powerful hypocrites, who overturned the tables of the money changers, who said it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. That Jesus was completely incompatible with empire. So they created a new version, a Jesus who preached submission to authority rather than resistance. A Jesus who promised rewards in heaven rather than demanding justice on earth. A Jesus who died for your sins rather than challenging you to transform your life. This wasn't evolution. This was engineering. Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, where bishops from across the empire gathered to standardize Christian doctrine. But here's the crucial detail. These weren't followers of Jesus debating theology. These were political appointees, serving imperial interests. Their job wasn't to preserve authentic teaching, it was to create a version of Christianity that would unify and pacify the empire. The council produced the Nicene Creed, which transformed Jesus from a human teacher into a divine being of the same substance as God the Father. This wasn't based on anything Jesus himself claimed. It was a theological construct designed to elevate him beyond human reach, making him an object of worship rather than an example to follow. But the most telling evidence of this manipulation comes from what happened to Jesus's original followers. The earliest Christian communities, particularly in Jerusalem, were led by Jesus's brother James and other family members who had actually known him. These Jewish Christians continued to follow Jewish law, worship in synagogues, and understand Jesus within his original cultural context. They never developed the theology of divine sacrifice that became central to later Christianity. They never taught that Jesus was God incarnate. They saw him as a prophet, a teacher, perhaps the Messiah, but not as a divine being to be worshipped. Yet by the end of the 4th century, these original Christian communities had been declared heretical and systematically eliminated. The people who actually knew Jesus were silenced so that the Roman version could prevail. This is the forbidden history they don't want you to know. The real Jesus wasn't the founder of Christianity as we know it today. He was its first victim. The movement that emerged in his name was the exact opposite of everything he stood for. Where Jesus challenged authority, the church demanded obedience. Where Jesus defended the oppressed, the church blessed the oppressor. Where Jesus taught inner transformation, the church offered external salvation through institutional membership. And this transformation wasn't accidental. It was the result of a calculated effort to weaponize Jesus' message for imperial purposes. The rebel who died on a Roman cross became the patron saint of Roman power. But here's what gives me hope, and what should give you hope too. The real Jesus refuses to stay buried. Despite centuries of institutional cover-up, despite the destruction of countless texts, despite the systematic rewriting of his story, glimpses of the authentic Jesus keep breaking through. In the desert discoveries of ancient manuscripts, in the growing recognition among scholars that the historical Jesus was radically different from the biblical Christ, in the increasing number of people who are walking away from institutional Christianity while still feeling drawn to the figure of Jesus himself. Because somewhere, beneath all the theological constructions and political manipulations, the voice of that first-century Jewish revolutionary still calls out, not from golden altars or stained glass windows, but from the margins of society where he always stood, with the poor, the outcast, the forgotten. And his message remains as dangerous today as it was 2,000 years ago. The kingdom of heaven isn't a place you go when you die. It's a reality you can create right here, right now, through radical love and fearless justice. But to hear that message clearly, you have to be willing to let go of everything you thought you knew about Jesus. You have to be willing to question not just individual doctrines, but the entire system that created them. Are you ready for that journey? Because once you start down this path, there's no going back. The comfortable Jesus of Sunday school can never satisfy you again once you've glimpsed the revolutionary who was too dangerous for his own religion. This is just the beginning. In our next part, we'll dive deeper into the specific ways Jesus' teachings were altered and weaponized, and we'll explore what his original message actually was before it was buried under centuries of imperial theology. The truth is out there, but it's not where they told you to look. The deeper you dig into this deception, the more shocking it becomes. Because it wasn't just about changing a few stories or adjusting some theological details. What happened to Jesus' message was a complete inversion of everything he represented. And the evidence is hiding in plain sight, scattered throughout the very Bible that claims to preserve his words. Let me show you something that will make your blood run cold. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus stands up in the synagogue and reads from the prophet Isaiah. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." This wasn't poetry. This was a political manifesto. Jesus was announcing a program of economic redistribution, prisoner amnesty, and social revolution. The year of the Lord's favor was a reference to the Jubilee year in Jewish law, when debts were forgiven, slaves were freed, and land was returned to its original owners. Yet somehow, this same passage gets preached in churches today as being about spiritual poverty and metaphorical blindness. The radical economic message has been completely neutered. Or take Jesus' most famous teaching, the Sermon on the Mount. "Blessed are the poor," he says. Not the poor in spirit as Matthew's later gospel softens it, just the poor. "Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you will laugh." This wasn't spiritual comfort food. This was revolutionary promise. Jesus was telling the dispossessed masses of first-century Palestine that their suffering wasn't God's will. It was human injustice, and it would be overturned. But here's where it gets truly sinister. The same institutions that buried Jesus' revolutionary message then used his name to justify the exact opposite. Crusades were launched in the name of the Prince of Peace. Slavery was defended using the teachings of the man who proclaimed freedom for captives. The Inquisition tortured people in the name of the one who said, "Blessed are the merciful." This wasn't hypocrisy. This was systematic perversion. And it worked because most people never got to read the actual texts for themselves. For over 1,000 years, the Bible was kept in Latin, accessible only to an educated elite who could interpret it however served their interests. When reformers like John Wycliffe tried to translate it into common languages, they were declared heretics. Wycliffe's bones were literally dug up and burned 40 years after his death. Why such extreme measures? Because they knew that if ordinary people could read Jesus' actual words, the entire power structure would collapse. When the Bible was finally translated into English, look what happened. Peasant revolts erupted across Europe. People read Jesus saying, "The last shall be first and the first shall be last," and decided maybe the social order wasn't divinely ordained after all. They read about Jesus driving the money changers from the temple and wondered why bishops lived in palaces while children starved in the streets. The authorities learned their lesson. From then on, Bible reading was carefully controlled, filtered through official interpretation, surrounded by so much theological complexity that ordinary people couldn't trust their own understanding of what they read. But the manipulation goes even deeper than translation. It reaches into the very structure of how these stories were told. Consider the crucifixion narrative itself. Every gospel presents it as a cosmic sacrifice for human sin, with Jesus willingly dying to appease God's wrath. But strip away the theological interpretation and look at the historical facts. What you see is a political execution. A revolutionary leader killed by an imperial power for challenging their authority. The Romans didn't crucify people for theological crimes. Crucifixion was reserved for rebels, insurrectionists, threats to the state. The sign above Jesus' cross read, "King of the Jews," not Saviour of souls, but a political charge. He died alongside 2 other rebels in a mass execution designed to send a message to anyone else who might challenge Roman rule. Yet somehow, this brutal act of state violence has been transformed into the centerpiece of a religion that preaches submission to earthly authority. The victim of empire became empire's greatest tool. And the most devastating part? This transformation was so complete that it infected how we read every other part of Jesus' story. Take the famous scene where Jesus is asked whether Jews should pay taxes to Caesar. The standard interpretation is that Jesus cleverly avoided political controversy by saying, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's," but look closer at what actually happened. Jesus asks to see a Roman coin, then points out that Caesar's image is on it. In Jewish law, making graven images was forbidden. By carrying and using Roman currency, the people had already compromised themselves. Jesus wasn't endorsing taxation. He was exposing the moral corruption of a system that forced people to violate their own sacred principles just to participate in economic life. This was brilliant subversion, not passive compliance, but it's been preached for centuries as a lesson in civic obedience. Or consider Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. The Gospels present Pilate as a reluctant judge, almost sympathetic to Jesus, pressured by bloodthirsty Jewish crowds. But this portrayal contradicts everything we know about Pilate from historical sources. He was a brutal governor, known for his cruelty and his hatred of Jewish customs. The idea that he would agonize over executing one more Jewish rebel is laughable. So why do the Gospels present him this way? Because by the time they were written, Christianity was trying to appeal to Roman audiences. They needed to shift blame away from Rome and onto the Jewish religious establishment. This wasn't historical accuracy. It was political calculation. And it laid the groundwork for centuries of anti-Semitism that culminated in the Holocaust. The blood of millions is on the hands of those who rewrote Jesus' story to serve their own purposes. But perhaps the most chilling example of this manipulation is what happened to Jesus' teachings about wealth and poverty. The historical Jesus was absolutely unambiguous on this topic. "Sell everything you have and give to the poor," he told the rich young ruler. "You cannot serve both God and money," he warned his disciples. "Woe to you who are rich, for you have already received your comfort." These weren't suggestions. They weren't metaphors. They were direct commands from someone who saw economic inequality as fundamentally incompatible with spiritual truth. Yet today, some of the wealthiest religious institutions on earth claim to follow this same Jesus. Prosperity gospel preachers fly in private jets while telling their followers that God wants them rich. Megachurch pastors live in mansions while the homeless sleep outside their doors. And somehow, this is all justified using the teachings of a man who said it was easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter heaven. The cognitive dissonance is staggering, but it makes perfect sense once you understand that these institutions aren't following the real Jesus. They're following the sanitized, empire-friendly version that was created to neutralize his actual message. And here's what should terrify you. This process of distortion never stopped. It's still happening today. Every time a politician uses Christian language to justify war, every time a preacher tells poor people their suffering is God's will, every time someone uses Jesus' name to defend systems of oppression and inequality, they're continuing the same project that began with Constantine. They're burying the real Jesus a little deeper. But here's what they can't bury: the power of his original vision. Because despite centuries of manipulation, despite institutional cover-ups, despite the destruction of countless texts and traditions, the authentic spirit of Jesus keeps breaking through. You see it in liberation theology movements across Latin America, where Christians rediscover Jesus as a champion of the poor. You see it in the civil rights movement, where leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. found in Jesus not a preacher of patience, but a prophet of justice. You see it every time someone risks their own comfort to stand with the oppressed, every time someone chooses love over fear, truth over comfort. The real Jesus refuses to stay dead. He keeps rising from the tomb of institutional religion, calling people back to his original message of radical transformation. But hearing that call requires something most people aren't willing to do. It requires letting go of the comfortable Jesus who makes no demands, who asks for nothing but belief, who promises heaven without requiring justice on earth. The real Jesus is far more dangerous than that. He doesn't just offer you eternal life. He demands that you live differently right now. He doesn't just promise to save your soul. He calls you to help save the world. And that's a Jesus most people, including most Christians, simply aren't ready to follow. But what if you are? What if you're tired of the sanitized version? What if you're ready to encounter the Jesus who was so threatening to the powers of his day that they had to kill him, and so dangerous to the powers of later days that they had to rewrite his entire story? Because that Jesus, the real one, is still calling, still challenging, still overturning tables and confronting hypocrites and standing with the forgotten. The question is, will you answer? The web of deception runs even deeper than most people dare to imagine. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just about changing a few Bible verses or adjusting some historical details. What happened was a complete hijacking of human consciousness itself, using the most powerful story ever told as the weapon. And the fingerprints of this manipulation are everywhere if you know where to look. Let's talk about Paul of Tarsus, because this is where the entire deception crystallizes. Here's a man who never met Jesus, never walked with him, never heard him teach. Yet somehow, Paul's letters make up nearly half of the New Testament. Think about that mathematical impossibility. The supposed founder of Christianity gets 4 Gospels, but a man who came after him gets 13 books. But here's what's truly disturbing. Paul's theology is fundamentally different from Jesus' teachings. Where Jesus spoke in parables and stories, Paul creates abstract theological systems. Where Jesus focused on how to live in this world, Paul obsesses over cosmic theories about sin and salvation. Where Jesus welcomed everyone to the table, Paul starts creating rules about who belongs and who doesn't. This wasn't accidental divergence. This was hostile takeover. Paul admits as much in his own letters. He brags about having visions of Jesus that contradict what the actual apostles taught. He gets into heated arguments with Peter and James, the people who actually knew Jesus, about fundamental aspects of the message. And when they disagree with him, Paul doesn't defer to their first-hand experience. He claims his revelation is superior to their memory. Imagine the audacity. It's like someone today claiming they understand Abraham Lincoln better than his own cabinet members because they had a dream about him. But Paul's version won out because it served imperial interests perfectly. His theology of original sin created permanent guilt that only institutional religion could address. His emphasis on faith over works made people passive rather than active. His complex theological arguments required professional interpreters, creating a priestly class with monopoly power over salvation. Jesus' simple message, love God, love your neighbor, create justice, was buried under layers of Pauline complexity that made ordinary people dependent on religious experts to understand their own spiritual lives. And once this theological foundation was laid, every subsequent manipulation became possible. Take the concept of hell, which has terrorized millions of people for centuries. Jesus himself never taught eternal conscious torment. When he used the word Gehenna, he was referring to a real place, a garbage dump outside Jerusalem where fires burned continuously. It was a metaphor for social decay, not cosmic punishment. But later theologians, influenced by Greek philosophy and Roman legal concepts, transformed this metaphor into a literal torture chamber. Augustine of Hippo, writing centuries after Jesus, created the doctrine of eternal damnation that has haunted Christianity ever since. Not because it was biblical, but because it was useful for controlling behavior. Fear works, always has. And a religion built on fear creates compliant followers who don't ask uncomfortable questions. The same pattern repeats with the doctrine of original sin. Jesus never taught that humans are born corrupted and deserving of punishment. In fact, he said the opposite, that we should become like little children to enter the kingdom of heaven. Children, in his view, were models of innocence, not examples of depravity. But Augustine, drawing on his own troubled relationship with sexuality and influenced by Roman legal concepts of inherited guilt, created the idea that Adam's sin somehow infected all of humanity. Suddenly, every baby was born damned, desperately needing salvation that only the church could provide. This wasn't theology. This was marketing. Create the problem, then sell the solution. And the solution always involved submission to institutional authority. Salvation became a commodity controlled by religious corporations, distributed according to their rules, their interpretations, their interests. But here's where the historical record becomes truly damning. We can trace exactly how this transformation happened because the early church fathers left extensive writings. And what they reveal is a deliberate, systematic campaign to suppress alternative understandings of Jesus. Irenaeus, writing in the 2nd century, literally created the concept of orthodoxy versus heresy. Before him, different Christian communities simply had different traditions, different emphases, different interpretations. Irenaeus turned this diversity into a war, declaring that only his version was legitimate and all others were demonic deceptions. His criteria for truth weren't based on historical accuracy or spiritual authenticity. They were based on institutional authority. The correct gospels were the ones that supported hierarchical church structure. The heretical ones were those that emphasized personal spiritual experience over institutional mediation. Clement of Alexandria went further, arguing that some truths were too dangerous for ordinary Christians to know. He created a two-tiered system where the masses got simplified stories while the elite received deeper mysteries. This wasn't spiritual wisdom, it was information control. And Tertullian, the so-called father of Latin Christianity, made the agenda crystal clear. He argued that once the apostolic age ended, all revelations ceased. No new insights were possible, no fresh understanding could emerge. The institutional church became the sole guardian of frozen truth. Think about the implications of this claim. It meant that a 1st century Palestinian Jewish teacher could never be understood more clearly by later generations. It meant that cultural evolution, historical research, and spiritual growth were all irrelevant to faith. It created a system where asking questions became heresy and blind acceptance became virtue. This wasn't preserving Jesus' message, this was entombing it. But the most sinister aspect of this transformation was how it weaponized Jesus' name for imperial purposes. Constantine didn't just make Christianity legal, he made it useful. The cross, symbol of Roman execution, became the banner of Roman conquest. Within decades of Constantine's conversion, Christian armies were marching across Europe, destroying pagan temples and forcing conversion at sword point. The religion of the crucified became the religion of the crucifier. And this wasn't some unfortunate corruption of pure origins. This was the inevitable result of the theological system that had been constructed. Once you teach that salvation comes through institutional membership rather than personal transformation, once you claim exclusive access to truth, once you demonize all alternatives as literally satanic, violence becomes not just possible, but necessary. The Crusades weren't a betrayal of Christianity. They were its logical conclusion. The Inquisition wasn't an aberration. It was systematic application of Orthodox theology. The burning of heretics wasn't excessive zeal. It was quality control. And the pattern continues today. Every time someone uses Jesus' name to justify exclusion, every time Christian nationalism wraps itself in holy language, every time prosperity preachers fleece their flocks while claiming divine blessing, they're following the same script that was written in the 4th century. They're using the manufactured Jesus to serve the interests of power. But here's what gives me hope, and what should give you hope too. The real Jesus keeps breaking through the institutional packaging. You see it in the Underground Railroad, where Christians risked everything to help enslaved people find freedom. You see it in liberation theology, where Latin American Christians rediscovered Jesus as champion of the oppressed. You see it in the civil rights movement, where faith became fuel for justice rather than justification for oppression. You see it every time someone reads the Sermon on the Mount and realizes it's calling for radical economic transformation, not just personal piety. Every time someone notices that Jesus spent more time talking about money than about heaven and hell combined. Every time someone asks why the Prince of Peace's followers have been responsible for so much violence throughout history, the questions themselves are dangerous to institutional power. Because once you start asking them, you can't stop. Once you realize how much has been hidden, distorted, and weaponized, you begin to see the manipulation everywhere. And that's when you face the ultimate choice. Do you retreat back into comfortable illusion, or do you keep digging toward uncomfortable truth? Because I'll warn you now, this path leads to some very dark places. When you realize how thoroughly Jesus' message has been corrupted, when you understand how many atrocities have been committed in his name, when you see how systematically his revolution has been turned into a tool of oppression, it can be overwhelming. Some people can't handle it. They'd rather cling to the sanitized Sunday school version than face the magnitude of the deception. But others find something else entirely. They discover that the real Jesus, the dangerous one, the revolutionary one, the one who was too threatening for his own religion, is still alive, still calling, still overturning tables and confronting hypocrites and standing with the forgotten. And they realize that following him isn't about joining the right denomination or believing the right doctrines. It's about embodying the same spirit that got him killed. The refusal to accept injustice, the commitment to radical love, the courage to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. That Jesus doesn't promise you a comfortable life. He doesn't guarantee prosperity or success or even safety. What he offers is something far more dangerous and far more beautiful. The chance to participate in the transformation of the world. But to accept that invitation, you have to be willing to let go of everything the institutional church taught you about what it means to be a Christian. You have to be prepared to follow a Jesus who might lead you into conflict with the very religious systems that claim to represent him. Are you ready for that? Because once you see who Jesus really was, you can never again be satisfied with who they said he was. The comfortable illusions crumble, and you're left with a choice that will define the rest of your life. Will you follow the Jesus of empire or the Jesus of revolution? The Jesus of institutional control, or the Jesus of liberation? The Jesus who makes no demands, or the Jesus who demands everything? The answer to that question doesn't just change how you see Christianity, it changes how you see everything. And here's where the deception becomes almost unbearably personal. Because it's not just about ancient history or theological abstractions. This manipulation has shaped your entire understanding of what it means to be human, what it means to be worthy, what it means to have purpose in this world. Think about the Jesus you were taught to pray to as a child. The one watching your every move, keeping score of your sins, demanding perfection while knowing you'd fail. That's not the historical Jesus. That's a psychological control mechanism designed to keep you spiritually dependent and emotionally stunted. The real Jesus never taught that you were born broken. He never said you needed to grovel for forgiveness. He never created a system where your worth depended on believing the right things or following the right rules. In fact, he consistently rejected that kind of religious thinking, calling it the tradition of men that makes void the word of God. But the institutional version flipped this completely. They took a teacher who said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you," and created a religion that said you're fundamentally separated from the divine. They took someone who ate with tax collectors and prostitutes and built a system obsessed with moral purity. They took a message of liberation and turned it into a prison of perpetual guilt. And the psychological damage has been catastrophic. Millions of people walk around carrying shame that was manufactured by religious institutions, not taught by Jesus. They live in fear of a hell he never preached, seeking approval from a God he never described, following rules he never established. The saddest part, many of these people genuinely love Jesus. They're drawn to something authentic in his story, something that speaks to their deepest longings for truth and justice and unconditional love. But they've been handed a counterfeit version so sophisticated that they can't tell the difference. It's like being in love with someone based on a completely fabricated profile. Everything you think you know about them is wrong, but your feelings are real. And when you discover the deception, you don't know whether to be heartbroken or relieved. But here's what's truly insidious about this system. It doesn't just control what you believe about Jesus. It controls what you believe is possible for yourself and for the world. When you're taught that humans are fundamentally sinful, you stop believing in the possibility of genuine transformation. When you're told that this world is fallen and only the next one matters, you stop working for justice in this life. When you're convinced that questioning authority is rebellion against God, you become complicit in your own oppression. This isn't accidental. This is the genius of the system they created. It uses your deepest spiritual longings to make you spiritually passive. It convinces you that humility means accepting injustice, that faith means not asking difficult questions, that love means enabling harmful behavior. And the most tragic irony is that people who follow this distorted version often become everything Jesus opposed. They become judgmental while thinking they're righteous. They become exclusionary while believing they're loving. They become supporters of oppression while convinced they're following the oppressed one. Look at how American Christianity has aligned itself with wealth, power, and nationalism, the very forces Jesus consistently challenged. Look at how it's been used to justify slavery, segregation, and the oppression of women. Look at how it's become a tool for political manipulation, with pastors telling people how to vote while claiming divine authority. This isn't Christianity gone wrong. This is the logical result of the theological system that was constructed in the 4th century. When you teach that God's primary concern is belief rather than behavior, when you make salvation about saying the right words rather than living the right way, when you prioritize doctrine over compassion, you inevitably create a religion that can be used to justify anything. And the people caught in this system aren't evil. Most of them are sincere, well-meaning individuals who genuinely want to follow God. But they've been given a map that leads them away from their destination. They're trying to follow Jesus, using directions written by his enemies. The tragedy is that many of them sense something's wrong. They read the Sermon on the Mount and feel convicted about their comfortable lifestyle. They read about Jesus welcoming outcasts and feel uncomfortable about their church's exclusionary practices. They read his warnings about wealth and wonder why their pastor drives a luxury car. But instead of trusting these instincts, they're taught to suppress them. They're told that if the Bible seems to contradict their church's teachings, they must be misunderstanding something. They're warned that questioning leadership is pride, that doubt is sin, that thinking for themselves is dangerous. So they silence their own moral intuition and submit to interpretations that often contradict everything Jesus actually stood for. They become accomplices to their own spiritual abuse. But here's what the system can't account for. Truth has a way of breaking through even the most sophisticated deceptions. People start noticing contradictions. They begin asking questions. They discover that the Jesus of history is radically different from the Jesus of their Sunday school lessons. And when that happens, everything changes. Some people respond with anger, and rightfully so. When you realize you've been lied to about the most important thing in your life, when you understand how your faith has been weaponized against your own values, when you see how you've been manipulated into supporting systems that Jesus would have opposed, rage is a natural response. Others respond with grief. They mourn the loss of certainty, the collapse of a worldview that gave their life meaning, the realization that much of what they've devoted their lives to was built on deception. But some respond with something else entirely: relief. Because finally, the contradictions make sense. Finally, they understand why the religion never quite felt right. Finally, they can embrace a Jesus who actually deserves their devotion. These are the people who discover that following the real Jesus isn't about joining a club or believing a creed. It's about embodying a way of life that threatens every system built on domination and exploitation. They realize that Jesus wasn't killed for his theology. He was killed for his politics. Not the partisan politics of left versus right, but the deeper politics of justice versus oppression, love versus fear, truth versus power. And they understand that following him means accepting the same risks he accepted. It means being willing to stand with the powerless even when it costs you. It means speaking truth even when it's unpopular. It means choosing love even when it's dangerous. This is the Jesus that the institutional church had to bury, because a religion built on this foundation couldn't be controlled by emperors or co-opted by empires. It would be too threatening, too transformative, too alive. But that Jesus refuses to stay buried. He keeps breaking out of the theological tombs they've built for him. He keeps appearing in unexpected places, in liberation movements, in acts of radical compassion, in moments when people choose justice over comfort. And every time he appears, the system tries to capture him again. They try to domesticate him, sanitize him, make him safe for empire once more. They create new versions of Christianity that claim his name while rejecting his message. But they can never quite succeed, because the truth has a power that transcends institutional control. The real Jesus, the dangerous one, the revolutionary one, keeps calling people out of systems of oppression and into authentic transformation. The question is whether you'll hear that call, whether you'll have the courage to leave behind the comfortable counterfeit and embrace the uncomfortable truth. Whether you'll be willing to follow a Jesus who makes no promises except this: that a life lived in radical love and fearless truth is worth whatever it costs. Because once you've seen who Jesus really was, you can never be satisfied with who they said he was. Once you've tasted the freedom of authentic faith, you can never again swallow the poison of manufactured religion. The choice is yours, but choose quickly. Because systems of oppression don't reform themselves. They have to be confronted by people willing to embody the same spirit that got Jesus killed. The same spirit that refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. the same Spirit that sees the divine in every human being, the same Spirit that believes another world is possible and is willing to sacrifice everything to make it real. That Spirit is calling your name right now. The question is, will you answer? But before you make that choice, you need to understand just how deep this deception goes. Because what I've shown you so far is just the surface. The real manipulation happened at a level so fundamental that most people never even think to question it. They didn't just change what Jesus said. They changed how we think about reality itself. They rewrote the very fabric of how we understand existence. And this goes far beyond theology into something much more sinister, the manipulation of human consciousness itself. You see, the Jesus of history lived in a world where the divine wasn't separate from everyday life. In first century Jewish understanding, the sacred permeated everything. God wasn't a distant ruler in the sky. God was the breath in your lungs, the justice in your actions, the love in your heart. This is why Jesus could say things like, "The kingdom of heaven is within you, and where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am also." He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was describing a lived reality where the divine and human weren't opposing forces but unified expressions of the same source. But this understanding was catastrophic for institutional control, because if the divine is already within you, if you already have direct access to sacred truth, then you don't need intermediaries. You don't need priests to intercede for you. You don't need bishops to interpret scripture for you. You don't need elaborate rituals to reach God. You're already there. You always have been. So they had to change that. They had to create what scholars call the Great Separation, the artificial divide between sacred and secular, divine and human, heaven and earth. This wasn't just theological innovation. This was psychological warfare. They convinced people that they were fundamentally disconnected from the divine. That sin had created an unbridgeable chasm between humanity and God. That only through their institution, their sacraments, their authority could that gap be crossed. And once people accepted this lie, everything else became possible. Because when you believe you're spiritually bankrupt, you'll accept any terms for salvation. When you think you're separated from God, you'll pay any price to get back in touch. This is why the Gospel of Thomas was so dangerous. When it recorded Jesus saying, "Split a piece of wood, and I am there. Lift up a stone, and you will find me there," it was preserving the original understanding. The divine isn't absent from the material world. It's the very essence of everything that exists. But that perspective had to be eliminated because it made religious institutions obsolete. Instead, they created dualistic thinking that split reality into opposing camps: spirit versus flesh, sacred versus profane, good versus evil, heaven versus earth. And they positioned themselves as the gatekeepers between these supposedly separate realms. This wasn't just bad theology. This was environmental destruction, social oppression, and psychological manipulation, all rolled into one comprehensive worldview. Think about it. Once you convince people that the material world is fallen, corrupt, and temporary, they stop caring about environmental destruction. Why worry about polluting the earth if it's just a testing ground for eternity? Once you teach that the body is sinful and the spirit is pure, you create shame about human sexuality, natural desires, and physical existence itself. People become alienated from their own bodies, seeing them as enemies rather than temples. Once you establish that some people have special access to divine truth while others don't, you justify every form of hierarchy and oppression. Suddenly it becomes natural for some to rule while others serve, for some to prosper while others suffer. The real Jesus challenged all of this. He touched lepers when touching them was forbidden. He ate with tax collectors when association with them was scandalous. He defended an adulteress when the religious law demanded her death. He was demonstrating that the sacred isn't separate from the supposedly profane, that the divine shows up especially in the places religious institutions declare off-limits, that God's love isn't conditional on purity, but is the very force that transforms impurity into wholeness. But this integrated understanding of reality was systematically dismantled and replaced with fragmented thinking that serves power structures perfectly. When you're taught to see life in disconnected pieces rather than as one unified whole, you become easier to manipulate. You can be convinced to support wars in the name of peace, to accept poverty in the name of prosperity, to enable oppression in the name of love, because you've lost the ability to see how everything connects, how your spiritual beliefs affect your political choices, how your economic system reflects your theological assumptions, how your treatment of the environment reveals what you really believe about the sacred. The Jesus of history understood these connections intimately. This is why he could flip tables in the temple, because he saw how economic exploitation was spiritual corruption. This is why he could challenge political authorities, because he understood that earthly power structures reflect heavenly realities. But the manufactured Jesus exists in a sanitized bubble, where faith has nothing to do with justice, where belief has nothing to do with behavior, where salvation has nothing to do with transformation. And this compartmentalization has created the bizarre spectacle of modern Christianity, where people can worship a homeless refugee on Sunday and vote to criminalize homelessness on Tuesday, where they can sing about loving their enemies while supporting endless wars, where they can pray to a brown-skinned Middle Eastern teacher while promoting white supremacy. The cognitive dissonance would be unbearable if they hadn't been trained from childhood to keep their spiritual beliefs separate from their practical choices. But here's what they couldn't erase completely: the human soul's longing for integration. People instinctively know that life should be whole, that faith should connect with action, that love should translate into justice. This is why so many sincere Christians feel frustrated with their churches. They sense that something essential is missing. They read Jesus' words about caring for the poor and wonder why their congregation seems more concerned with building programs than feeding the hungry. They study his teachings about nonviolence and feel uncomfortable when their pastors bless military interventions. They encounter his radical inclusion of outcasts and notice how many people still feel unwelcome in their communities. These aren't minor inconsistencies. These are symptoms of a fundamental betrayal that goes back to the very foundations of institutional Christianity. Because the system was never designed to create Jesus followers, it was designed to create Jesus worshippers. People who would admire him from a distance while living completely different lives. And the most insidious part is how this worship becomes a substitute for discipleship. People convince themselves they're being faithful by believing the right things about Jesus, rather than by doing the things Jesus actually did. They memorize verses about his divinity while ignoring his humanity. They debate theological fine points while missing his clear ethical demands. They argue about his nature while avoiding his example. This is why you can have millions of people who claim to follow Jesus while creating societies that Jesus would find abhorrent. They've been trained to see following him as an intellectual exercise rather than a life commitment. But the real Jesus never asked anyone to worship him. Every time someone tried to exalt him above humanity, he redirected their attention back to the work of transformation. "Why do you call me good?" he asked. "No one is good except God alone." He wasn't denying his connection to the divine. He was insisting that the same connection was available to everyone. The kingdom of heaven wasn't his exclusive domain. It was humanity's shared inheritance. This is the message that had to be suppressed. Because a religion based on this understanding wouldn't produce passive consumers of spiritual services. It would create active agents of social transformation. It wouldn't generate wealth for religious institutions. It would redistribute wealth to those who need it most. It wouldn't support existing power structures. It would challenge them at their foundations. And this brings us to the most shocking realization of all. The institutional church didn't just fail to preserve Jesus' message. It became the primary obstacle to that message taking root in human consciousness. Every time someone discovers the real Jesus, they have to overcome centuries of religious programming designed to prevent that discovery. They have to unlearn everything they were taught in Sunday school. They have to recognize that much of what they call faith is actually fear in disguise. They have to face the terrifying possibility that following Jesus might cost them everything they've built their identity around: their community, their certainty, their sense of being right while others are wrong. Because the real Jesus doesn't offer you a better version of the life you're already living. He offers you a completely different life altogether. One where your security comes from love rather than from power. Where your identity comes from service rather than from status. Where your joy comes from giving rather than from getting. And that kind of transformation is exactly what every system of control works desperately to prevent. Because people who are truly free don't stay enslaved. People who know their own divine nature don't accept being treated as less than human. People who understand their connection to all of life don't participate willingly in systems that destroy life. This is why the real Jesus had to be buried so deeply. This is why so many alternative gospels had to be destroyed. This is why centuries of theology had to be constructed to hide the simple, revolutionary truth he embodied. But here's what gives me hope, and what should terrify those who profit from the current system. Truth is more powerful than deception. Love is stronger than fear. And the human spirit's longing for authentic connection cannot be permanently suppressed. The real Jesus keeps breaking through, in liberation movements around the world, in acts of radical compassion that cross every boundary, in moments when people choose justice over comfort, truth over convenience, love over safety. Every time someone stands with the oppressed, speaks truth to power, or refuses to accept injustice as inevitable, the real Jesus lives again. Not as a figure to be worshipped, but as a spirit to be embodied. And once you've experienced that embodiment, once you've felt what it's like to live from love rather than from fear, you can never go back to the counterfeit version. The manufactured Jesus becomes as appealing as cardboard compared to the feast of authentic transformation. But here's the warning that comes with this awakening. The system will not give up without a fight. The more clearly you see the deception, the more threatening you become to those who profit from it. They'll question your faith. They'll challenge your loyalty. They'll suggest you're being deceived by pride or rebellion or demonic influence, because they can't afford to let others see what you've seen. They can't risk the possibility that their carefully constructed illusion might crumble under the weight of truth. But that's exactly what's going to happen. Because the real Jesus isn't just a historical figure. He's a force of transformation that continues to work in the world wherever people are willing to embody radical love and fearless truth. The question isn't whether this transformation will come. The question is whether you'll be part of it, or whether you'll cling to the comfortable lies that keep you enslaved to systems that Jesus died opposing. The choice is yours. But choose quickly, because the world is burning, people are suffering. And the manufactured Jesus of institutional religion offers no real solutions to the crises we face. Only the real Jesus, the revolutionary, the liberator, the one who shows us what it looks like to live as fully human and fully divine, can guide us toward the transformation our world desperately needs. But following that, Jesus requires everything. Your certainty, your comfort, your need to be right, your desire to be safe. What he offers in return is something far more valuable: the chance to participate in the healing of the world, the opportunity to discover who you really are when you're not defined by fear, the possibility of living a life so aligned with love and truth that it becomes itself a form of resurrection. That's the real gospel. That's the message they tried to bury. And that's the invitation that's being extended to you right now. Will you accept it? The choice you're facing right now isn't just about religion or theology or ancient history. It's about the very foundation of how you see yourself, how you understand your purpose, and how you navigate a world that desperately needs the kind of transformation the real Jesus embodied. Because here's what happens when you truly encounter the historical figure behind all the manufactured theology. You realize that everything changes. Not just your beliefs about God, but your understanding of what it means to be human in the first place. The real Jesus didn't see divinity as something separate from humanity. He saw it as the deepest truth about what we all are. When he said, "You are the light of the world," he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was revealing something that religious institutions have spent centuries trying to make you forget. You are sacred, not because you believe the right things, not because you follow the right rules, not because you belong to the right group. You are sacred because existence itself is sacred, because consciousness itself is divine, because the same creative force that flows through everything flows through you. But accepting that truth comes with a price, because once you know who you really are, you can't unknow it. Once you see through the illusions that keep people trapped in systems of control and oppression, you can't pretend you don't see them anymore. And that's when the real work begins. Not the work of believing harder or praying more or attending services regularly. The work of becoming who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning and fear. The work of standing up when others stay seated. The work of speaking truth when others remain silent. The work of choosing love when others choose safety. This is what the manufactured Jesus was designed to prevent. Because people who know their own divine nature don't accept being treated as expendable. People who understand their connection to all of life don't participate willingly in systems that destroy life. And that's exactly what the world needs right now. Not more believers in a distant deity, but more people willing to embody divine love in practical, courageous, transformative ways. The crises we face, environmental collapse, economic inequality, endless warfare, the breakdown of community, these aren't just political problems. They're spiritual problems, rooted in the fundamental lie that we're separate from each other and from the sacred. The real Jesus understood this. This is why he could look at systems of oppression and see them as spiritual sickness. This is why he could touch untouchables and eat with outcasts and challenge authorities. He was demonstrating what becomes possible when you live from the truth of interconnection rather than the illusion of separation. The truth is out there, waiting for anyone brave enough to seek it. But it's not waiting in the pews of churches or the pages of institutional doctrine. It's waiting in the margins, in the questions that make people uncomfortable, in the revolutionary spirit that refuses to be contained by empire's chains. The real Jesus was never meant to be worshipped from a safe distance. He was meant to be followed into the dangerous territory of radical love and fearless justice. And once you've seen who he really was, there's no going back to the comfortable lie they sold you in Sunday school.